does exercise cause the lungs to work harder? Let's take a look at the lungs and their work, starting with an artificial lung, heart and lungs during open heart surgery. Quite a complicated machine. And yet the part that actually does the work of the lungs is quite simple. A plastic sac with blood passing through. Notice the difference between the blood coming from the patient's body and the blood being pumped back. Why the difference? Well, carbon dioxide is being removed from the blood and oxygen is being added. The oxygen gives the blood a brighter red color. All lungs have the same function, supplying the oxygen that body cells need to produce energy. But do all lungs have the same structure? A frog's lungs have a network of many blood vessels. And the lungs are rather like air-filled balloons. In fact, the air in the lungs helps a frog float in water. We've cut a frog's lung into sections so we can see the inner surface. The inner lining has small folds extending outward and dividing the surface into many small sections. We can get an even better look by actually going inside the lung of a living frog with a very specialized device called an endoscope. We're using high magnification to get a close-up view of some of the small sections of the inner lining and also the complex network of blood vessels. The larger blood vessels divide and subdivide, becoming smaller and smaller. To see the smallest blood vessels, we need a microscope. This is a meshwork of capillaries, small blood vessels with very thin walls. Through the walls of the capillaries, oxygen from the air in the lungs can pass into the blood, where it's taken up by the red blood cells. And carbon dioxide passes from the blood into the lungs to be exhaled. Exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide, that's the function of the lungs in every animal. But are there any differences in lung structure? Frog's lungs and rat's lungs. Not at all like a hollow sac or balloon. Now, the structure of a rat's lungs is the same as our own, or those of any mammal. For a close look at that structure, we can go inside a living lung. The air we breathe passes the vocal cords, which are part of the larynx, or voice box, and then moves into the trachea, or windpipe. Rings of cartilage hold the windpipe open. Branching off from the trachea are two tubes, the bronchi, each carrying air to one of the lungs. And now we're beginning to see something of the structure of the lungs themselves. The bronchi divide and divide, forming a complex system of breathing passages that can be shown in an X-ray by means of a contrast technique. And for an even better idea of our lung structure, we can use this model. It's clear why this system of tubes is often called the bronchial tree. Actually, the structure is even more complex than the model can show. Look at the very tip of any one of the smallest branches and imagine it magnified several hundred times. Here's where the real work of the lungs takes place, in tiny air sacs called alveoli. This cluster of alveoli is actually only about 5 millimeters wide. Some of the alveoli have been cut open to show a cross-section. Here's the real thing under a microscope. All told, our lungs have about 600 million of these tiny air sacs. Outside the wall of each living air sac are several tiny capillaries. Here's a cross-section of one air sac and a capillary. Carbon dioxide passes through a thin membrane into the air sac, and oxygen passes into the blood. No matter how simple or complex the structure, the work of the lungs is always the same. But if that's true, why do we need such a complex lung structure? Well, imagine that this curved strip of glass represents the outer surface of a lung. And this strip of sponge, which can be bent into various shapes, can represent the thin membrane which allows oxygen and carbon dioxide to pass through. First, we'll try to represent the simplest possible type of lung structure, a hollow lung with a lining of membrane. Now, oxygen can pass into the blood only where it's actually in contact with the membrane. So the amount of membrane will determine how much oxygen can be absorbed. So this represents the amount of membrane available to absorb oxygen in the simplest type of lung structure. We'll arrange it so we can see the total area easily for comparison with other types. Now, what other way of arranging the membrane inside the lung? Watch. Without increasing the size of the lung, we now have more membrane in contact with the air, so more oxygen can be absorbed. We'll remove the membrane so it can be arranged for a comparison of total area. Quite an improvement. But can we do even better? So, a more complex structure can help the lungs do a more efficient job of providing enough oxygen. With 600 million alveoli, our lungs can provide the oxygen we need, not only for ordinary activity, but also when the need for extra energy requires an extra supply of oxygen. Greater efficiency in providing oxygen, that's the advantage of a complex lung structure.